There is a certain person in almost every social circle who becomes the emotional anchor. The one people call when they're overwhelmed. The one who listens without interrupting, who understands without judging. Who gives clarity when others are confused. Over time, they become known for it, trusted for it, relied on for it. And slowly, without ever choosing the role consciously, they become the therapist friend. From the outside, this person looks emotionally intelligent, stable, wise, grounded. They seem unshakable. People assume they must be fine after all. They're the one helping everyone else. But inside, there is often a deep and quiet loneliness. Because the therapist friend is usually the one with no one to talk to. The psychology of the therapist friend is not about being selfless or strong by nature. It is about a pattern formed early, reinforced socially, and rarely questioned until emotional exhaustion sets in. It is about becoming fluent in other people's inner worlds while being increasingly disconnected from your own being witnessed. One of the first things to understand is that therapist friends are rarely accidental. This role almost always begins early in life, often in childhood. Often in environments where emotional safety was inconsistent, adults were overwhelmed, or feelings were not handled reliably. The child learns quickly that attunement is survival, reading moods, anticipating needs. Staying emotionally available, listening becomes a skill. Understanding becomes protection. That child grows up emotionally observant, perceptive, and regulated at least on the surface. They learn how to stay calm when others are distressed, how to make sense of chaos, how to hold space, and because this skill is rewarded, praised, relied upon, admired, it solidifies into identity. I'm the one people come to. Another psychological layer is that therapist friends often develop a strong sense of responsibility for others' emotions. They don't just listen, they absorb, they internalize. They feel subtly responsible for helping others feel better, not because anyone explicitly asks them to, but because they learned that being useful emotionally keeps connection intact. Connection becomes conditional, value becomes tied to availability. Over time, this creates a one-directional relational pattern. Others talk, the therapist friend listens. Others unload, the therapist friend contains. And because they are so good at it, no one stops to ask how they're doing. They don't appear to need it. Another critical factor is emotional competence masking emotional need. Therapist friends are often deeply self-aware. They can articulate feelings, offer perspective, regulate reactions. This creates the illusion that they don't need support themselves. Competence becomes invisibility. People assume they've got it handled, so no one checks in. Or if they do, it's brief, surface level, because the therapist friend doesn't push. They don't demand, they don't want to burden anyone. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends often suppress their own emotional expression. Not consciously, but habitually, they are so attuned to others that their own feelings take a back seat. When they do feel overwhelmed, they rationalize it, minimize it, handle it privately. They don't want to flip the roles, they don't want to need. This creates emotional isolation, not from lack of relationships, but from lack of reciprocity. Another layer is identity fusion. Being the supportive one becomes who they are. If they stop listening, who are they? If they say no, will people still want them? If they express anger, sadness, or confusion, will they still be trusted? So they stay composed, even when they're unraveling inside. Another important psychological factor is that therapist friends often confuse intimacy with caretaking. They are closest to people when they are needed. When others are vulnerable, when there is a problem to solve. Calm, stable moments feel oddly empty. Connection becomes tied to crisis. This makes it very hard for therapist friends to receive support. Being on the receiving end feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, sometimes even unsafe. They don't know how to take up emotional space without guilt. Another misunderstood aspect is burnout. Therapist friends often burn out quietly. They don't collapse dramatically, they become numb, detached, irritable. They start withdrawing not because they don't care, but because they are depleted. They have been emotionally available for everyone except themselves. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends are often chosen by others instinctively. People sense safety, non-judgment, presence. The therapist friend doesn't interrupt, doesn't dominate, doesn't compete. That makes them magnetic to people who need to be heard. But magnetism without boundaries is exhausting. Another layer is emotional boundary erosion. Therapist friends often don't know where their responsibility ends. They think about other people's problems long after conversations end. They carry emotional residue, they ruminate. Rest never fully restores them. Another important factor is that therapist friends often downplay their own pain. Others have it worse. I can handle this. It's not a big deal. This comparison invalidates their own experience and delays help seeking. They become experts at empathy for everyone but themselves. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends often grew up being the mediator, the peacemaker, the one who calmed arguments, smoothed tension, took care of emotional adults. This early role taught them that emotional labor is expected, not optional. Saying no feels like betrayal. Another layer is fear of vulnerability. Therapist friends may fear that if they open up, others will not know how to handle it. They've never seen those people in the listening role. They worry about being misunderstood, minimized, or overwhelming, so they stay silent. Another misunderstood aspect is that therapist friends often crave deep connection. They want to be known, seen, held emotionally. But because they are always the container, they rarely get the chance. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone, it comes from being unseen. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends often attract emotionally unavailable people. People who like to talk, but not listen, who share, but don't inquire, who receive support, but don't reciprocate. The pattern reinforces itself. Another layer is guilt. Therapist friends often feel guilty for wanting less emotional labor, for needing space, for resenting being relied on. They judge themselves harshly for normal human limits. This guilt keeps them trapped. If you recognize yourself in this, it's important to hear this clearly. Being the therapist friend is not a personality trait. It is a role you learned, and roles can be renegotiated. Another crucial psychological layer of the therapist friend is how deeply their sense of safety is tied to usefulness. For many of them, being needed is not just something they do, it's how they remain connected. When they are helping, listening, stabilizing, they feel anchored. When they are not, an unfamiliar anxiety can surface. If I'm not useful, will I still belong? This question often lives far below consciousness, but it shapes behavior relentlessly. It keeps the therapist friend emotionally available even when exhausted. It makes them answer messages late at night. It makes them say yes when their body is begging for rest. It makes them feel uneasy when relationships feel calm rather than urgent. Another important factor is emotional asymmetry becoming normalized. Therapist friends grow so accustomed to one-sided emotional exchange that it starts to feel ordinary. They don't expect reciprocity. In fact, when someone does ask deeply about them, they may deflect, joke, or change the subject. Receiving care feels awkward, giving care feels natural. This imbalance slowly reshapes their expectations of relationships. They stop imagining being supported and start assuming they must self-soothe alone. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends often intellectualize their own emotions. Because they are skilled at understanding feelings conceptually, they analyze instead of experiencing. They explain their pain rather than sitting in it. They reframe instead of grieving. They make sense of things too quickly. Insight replaces intimacy with self. This keeps them functional, but distant from themselves. Another layer is the fear of emotional messiness. Therapist friends often pride themselves on being composed, being the calm one, the grounded one. Losing control feels dangerous not because emotions are bad, but but because it threatens the identity that kept them safe. If I fall apart, who am I? This fear makes vulnerability feel risky. They may believe that if they truly open up, they will overwhelm others or lose respect. Another important psychological factor is selective disclosure. Therapist friends may share facts about their life, but not feelings. Events, not impact. They appear open, but remain emotionally guarded. This creates the illusion of closeness without true mutuality. People know what happened to them, not how it felt. Another layer is emotional labor invisibility. Therapist friends perform enormous emotional work, but because it doesn't look like labor, it goes unrecognized. There are no metrics, no acknowledgments, no recovery time built in. They are always fine until they aren't. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends often become resentful without realizing it. Not explosive resentment, but quiet withdrawal. They stop initiating, they reply later. They feel drained around people they once cared for deeply. This resentment isn't about lack of love, it's about lack of balance. Another layer is grief for unmet needs. Therapist friends often reach a point where they realize how much they have held alone. How many nights they were the one listening, calming, reassuring while having no one to lean on themselves. That realization can be painful, it can also be clarifying. Another important factor is that therapist friends often believe they are too much emotionally. Ironically, the very people who hold everyone else's emotions believe that their own would be a burden. This belief is usually learned early through subtle cues, not explicit rejection. So they stay small emotionally, even when they are drowning. Another psychological dimension is that therapist friends often attract crises, not stability. People come to them when things are falling apart, but drift away when life is calm. This creates a distorted sense of connection. Closeness equals chaos. Peace feels lonely. Another layer is the absence of mirroring. Being listened to helps us understand ourselves. When therapist friends are never truly listened to, their self-understanding can become fragmented. They know others deeply, but feel oddly unclear about themselves. They are witnesses without mirrors. Another important psychological truth is that therapist friends often struggle to ask for help. Not because they don't need it, but because asking feels like role reversal, like breaking an unspoken contract. They don't know how to phrase their needs without minimizing them. I'm fine, but it's not a big deal, but their requests come wrapped in apology. Another layer is that therapist friends often feel emotionally older than their peers. They have seen too much, held too much, too early. This creates distance. They feel out of sync socially. Even when surrounded by people, they are present, but not accompanied. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends are often deeply compassionate, but compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. Empathy turns into obligation. Care turns into depletion. The skill that once protected them becomes the thing that exhausts them. Another layer is the moment of awakening. For many therapist friends, there comes a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes painful, when they realize the cost of their role. A moment when they feel unseen despite being surrounded. When they realize no one knows how tired they are. This moment can feel like betrayal, but it is also an invitation. An invitation to renegotiate identity, to learn that care does not have to be one-directional. That being loved does not require being useful. Another important psychological truth is that letting go of the therapist role often comes with fear. Fear of losing relationships, fear of disappointing others, fear of being perceived as cold or selfish. But what often happens instead is filtering. Some relationships fade, others deepen, new ones form. Another layer is learning to tolerate being ordinary in relationships. Not the fixer, not the anchor, just a person with feelings, needs, and limits. This feels uncomfortable at first. It can even feel like failure, but it is actually integration. Another psychological truth is that therapist friends often rediscover parts of themselves once they stop carrying everyone else. playfulness, anger, desire, creativity. They remember who they were before they became the emotional container. Another important factor is learning that empathy does not require self-sacrifice. You can care deeply without carrying everything. You can listen without absorbing. You can be present without disappearing. Boundaries do not destroy connection, they make it sustainable. Understanding the psychology of the therapist friend reframes their struggle. It shows that their loneliness is not because they are unlovable, but because they were over-relied upon. That their burnout is not weakness, but exhaustion from unreciprocated care. You were not meant to hold everyone, you were meant to be held too. You do not lose your empathy when you stop overgiving, you reclaim it. And when the therapist friend finally finds space to speak, it is truly heard. The silence that carried for so long begins to lift, not because they fixed themselves, but because they were finally met.